Mr Charles was a mysterious character who came to visit Ireland in the 1740s. At the same time Handel was here. We know very little about his life. He's called Mr Charles the Hungarian. He probably came through France. He was playing French horn. He set up a business in Dublin. He was giving lessons in the horn to the gentlemen of the town. Hunting in Ireland was hugely popular. People used to go from Stephen's Green, Merrion Square, head out for the day up the mountains, Dublin mountains, up to the Hellfire Club, all around there. Hunt, then come home for dinner, because it was within shooting distance of Dublin. But big part of hunting is the hunting horn. You can use the horn to make calls across the fields to tell somebody where the deer is or whatever you happen to be hunting. So it's kind of basically in the 18th century, having a set of horns in your household was like having like an iPhone 13, 14, the latest technology. And Mr Charles came to Dublin to sell this technology to the Irish public. He also put on lots of concerts. Very cheekily, he put on concerts of Handel's music at the same time that Handel was in Dublin, which was extraordinary. You can only imagine how Handel felt about this. In the same concert hall, using a lot of the same musicians, but you get the impression that even though we don't know much about Mr Charles, that he was a big showman. His amazing ads in the newspaper from the time. He was introducing lots of really strange and new instruments to the concert platform in Ireland. He says that the chalumeau, the oboe d'amore, heard for the first time in this kingdom. He also probably travelled with his family quite a lot, because you see that his son plays in some of his concerts, his wife, so there's even female horn players at the time. And then occasionally you see black horn players too, which is really fascinating cultural document. It turns out that a lot of ex-slaves coming from America, their way into society in Ireland and Britain, I suppose at the time, was to work with horses. And a lot of the people dealing with horses also played horn. So there's lovely portraits at the time of black horn players. So it's a fascinating, slightly mysterious era in history, and I'm totally fascinated with this guy, Mr Charles.
Mr Charles is a very fascinating character in the history of the horn. I would love to be able to give you much more details about him, but he seems to be quite a mysterious character. For example, he's known as Mr Charles the Hungarian. We don't really seem to know where he actually came from, so Hungarian could be as in foreign. But he turns up in the United Kingdom and comes over to Ireland in around about the mid-18th century. And for us horn players, this is a really exciting time in the evolution of our instrument, because unlike a lot of the other instruments that you'll hear on this disc, we're quite late to the party. The horn only comes into the musical world really at the tail end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century. That's the time that we go from being the hunting horn players to real musicians. So Mr Charles and his career is an example of the time when horn players started to be really recognised musicians, and in his case quite entrepreneurial as well. So it's a moment when our instrument really gets accepted, and we start to see lots of exciting new music being written for it, especially by composers such as Handel and people around him, such as Mr Charles himself. It's so often the case when we look at things that are going on the 18th century that there are female musicians and musicians of a much more diverse background that we don't hear about so often, but were very, very much part of the musical landscape. One of the things that I find fascinating about Mr Charles's work is that if you see all the concert programs that he was putting on in all sorts of places, we can glean a lot of information about his musical world. So we do see mentions of his son, of his wife. We also see one of the big things in the 18th century was there was a big tradition of black horn players, which is very, very well documented. So we see that horn playing, I suppose it was also because it wasn't the sort of instrument that you would take up necessarily if you were gentrified. You quite often see things about if you want to learn sort of the harpsichord or the flute or the violin, go here, and the back door is for the servants to come and learn the horn. But we see the horn being played by a much wider community of musicians than I think we give credit to today.
We're really fortunate in that we have a newspaper report of exactly what Mr Charles played in one of his concerts. So in our programme here, we're recording in Drogheda, we're trying to recreate that. We can't quite do everything, but we can do a lot of it. Some of the music's really clear, like Handel's Water music, but some of the things we have to kind of find our way a little bit. For instance, he says that there's a concerto a solo on the clarinet, the oboe d'amore, and the chalumeau. So we've had to dig around a little bit and look for these pieces, and pieces that would have been appropriate for the time and would have been known in Ireland at the time. And also asking our wonderful musicians, you know, we've got this amazing team of wind players, and they've made so many great suggestions of what these pieces could be. So we've pieced it together for a large part, but there's works by Handel, we have Hasse as well, who made who's a very important composer on the Dublin scene. We have a composer called Bocchi, who is a cellist who lived in Dublin for a long time and published cello music when he was here. And then yeah, quite a lot of Handel crops up, as it did in concert programs at the time.